They say power reveals who you truly are. But what happens when power is the only thing you ever had? And the woman you destroyed was the one holding it all along? Stay with me until the end. You'll see a man who thought he owned the world learn what it means to lose everything, including himself. Shows. The winter of 1847 arrived in London like a blade wrapped in silk. Snow fell over Blackthorn Manor in thick, elegant sheets, transforming the estate into something from a fairy tale, all glittering windows and candlelit warmth spilling onto manicured gardens. Inside the grand ballroom, 300 of England's finest aristocrats drank champagne that cost more than most families earned in a year. And Duke Adrian Blackthorn stood at the center of it all, king of absolutely nothing. He didn't know that yet. He moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world owed him its attention. Tall, sharp-featured, impeccably dressed in midnight blue velvet, Adrian commanded space the way only the truly entitled can. Not through effort, but through the assumption that everyone else should simply make room. His dark hair was swept back, his smile perpetually amused, as if life itself were a private joke only he understood. At his side, draped in crimson silk that clung to every curve, walked Celeste Montrose. She wasn't his wife. Everyone knew it. The musicians knew it. The servants knew it. The bishops and barons and bankers filling his ballroom knew it. Most importantly, Duchess Eveline Blackthorn knew it, and she stood barely 20 feet away, watching her husband parade his mistress through her own home like a trophy won at cards. Adrian glanced at Eveline once, briefly, the way you might glance at furniture you've grown tired of. She stood near the east windows in a gown of pale gray, hands folded, expression serene. Boring, he thought. She'd always been boring. Pretty enough when he married her 6 years ago. Soft brown hair, delicate features, the kind of quiet beauty that photographs well but fades in memory. The Ashford family had money, respectability, all the right connections. Marrying her made sense. Loving her never did. Celeste laughed at something he said, her voice carrying across the ballroom like music. Heads turned. Adrian felt the familiar rush of validation, the drug he'd been chasing since childhood. This was what mattered. Not some merchant's daughter playing duchess, not responsibility or duty or whatever tedious sermon his father used to preach before dying and leaving Adrian an empire he never earned. He raised his glass. The crowd quieted. Adrian Blackthorn enjoyed making announcements. He was good at them. The pause, the smile, the casual arrogance that made people lean in. "My friends," he began, voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "Tonight, we gather not merely to celebrate the season, but to acknowledge a new era for House Blackthorn." Eveline's expression didn't change. She simply stood there, hands still folded, eyes fixed somewhere past his shoulder. It infuriated him, that calm. She should weep. She should scream. She should give him something to react against, some justification for what he was about to do. She gave him nothing. As many of you know, the management of an estate as vast as ours requires exceptional skill, vision, energy. He let his gaze drift to Celeste, who smiled up at him with practiced adoration. "I'm pleased to announce that Lady Celeste Montrose will be taking a more formal role in the household. She'll oversee social functions, manage certain domestic affairs, and serve as my official partner in all matters of hospitality." The ballroom went silent. Not the good kind of silent. The kind where 300 people simultaneously realize they're watching something uglier than they anticipated. A few women exchanged glances. Lord Pembroke coughed into his champagne. Even the musicians stopped playing, uncertain whether the pause was intentional. Adrian didn't care. Let them whisper. Let them judge. He was Duke Adrian Blackthorn, and this was his house, his title, his life. If he wanted to install his mistress as pseudo-duchess, while his actual wife stood 10 yards away, who in God's name would stop him? Certainly not Eveline. She lifted her glass in a small, graceful gesture, almost a toast, and took a single sip. Then she smiled. Not bitterly, not tragically, just smiled. The kind of smile you give when someone tells a mildly amusing story at dinner. It should have felt like victory. Instead, something cold touched the base of Adrian's spine. Something he didn't have words for yet. Something that felt uncomfortably like standing on ice that hadn't frozen all the way through. He dismissed it, turned back to the crowd, raised his glass higher, to new beginnings. A few people echoed the toast. Most didn't. The musicians started playing again, too loud, trying to fill the horrible awkwardness spreading through the room like spilled wine. Evelyn set down her glass and walked toward the exit. Nobody stopped her. Nobody followed her. She simply left her own party, back straight, steps unhurried, and disappeared into the portrait gallery beyond the ballroom. Adrian watched her go and felt nothing. Relief, maybe. One less weight to carry, one less responsibility pretending to matter. Celeste squeezed his arm. "You were magnificent," she whispered. He believed her. 3 weeks later, Adrian's banker arrived unannounced. The man's name was Gerald Thorne, a thin, nervous creature who'd managed Blackthorne finances for a decade without ever once disagreeing with Adrian about anything. Thorne wore the same gray suit every meeting, carried the same leather portfolio, and had the perpetually apologetic expression of someone who spent his life delivering bad news and getting blamed for it. This morning, he looked worse than usual. Adrian received him in the study, a vast oak-paneled room lined with books Adrian had never read, and maps of properties Adrian barely remembered owning. Sunlight poured through tall windows, illuminating dust motes and the faint smell of old tobacco. Thorne. Adrian didn't look up from the contract he was pretending to review. "This had better be urgent. I have an appointment at my club in an hour." Thorne set his portfolio on the desk with the careful precision of a man defusing a bomb. "Your Grace, we need to discuss the quarterly reports." "Do we?" Adrian finally looked up, already bored. "I assume everything's in order?" "It always is." "No, Your Grace, it isn't." The words hung in the air like smoke. Adrian frowned. "What are you talking about?" Thorne opened the portfolio, hands shaking slightly. He pulled out a stack of documents, each one stamped with official seals and signatures Adrian vaguely recognized. "The Royal Noble Bank has frozen your primary accounts pending investigation into outstanding debts. The Coal Consortium in Durham reports operational suspension due to unpaid wages. 2 of your largest shipping contracts were quietly canceled last month, and the shipping company itself appears to have restructured ownership." Adrian stared at him. "That's impossible." "I'm afraid it's quite factual, Your Grace." "Then fix it." Adrian's voice sharpened. "That's what I pay you for, isn't it? Go to the bank, talk to whoever needs talking to, throw money at the problem until it goes away." Thorne's face went pale. "Your Grace, that's the issue. There is no money to throw." Silence. Adrian stood slowly, the way a snake uncoils. "Explain that sentence." Thorne swallowed. "The Blackthorne estate, as you understand it, has been operating at a significant loss for nearly 4 years. The only reason creditors haven't seized assets is because someone has been quietly paying debts, renegotiating contracts, and maintaining liquidity through what I can only describe as extraordinary financial maneuvering." "Someone," Adrian repeated slowly. "Yes, Your Grace." "Who?" Thorne hesitated. Then he slid a single document across the desk. It was a transfer agreement, dated 5 years prior, signed by Adrian himself, his signature unmistakable, bold and careless as always, granting full operational and financial authority over all Blackthorne holdings to Duchess Evelyn Ashford Blackthorne. Adrian stared at the paper like it was written in a foreign language. "This is a mistake. I assure you, it isn't. I never signed this." "You did, Your Grace. I witnessed it myself. You were quite enthusiastic at the time. You said, and I quote, 'Let her play accountant if it keeps her occupied. I have better things to do than read contracts.'" The memory surfaced slowly, reluctantly. A warm spring afternoon, Evelyn in his study, explaining something tedious about estate management. Him half drunk from lunch, scrawling his name on whatever she put in front of him just to make her stop talking so he could leave for the races. "That was symbolic," Adrian said, voice rising. "A formality. She's my wife, not my, your business partner?" Thorne's voice was very quiet. "Your Grace, she's been far more than that. Every profitable venture bearing the Blackthorne name for the past 5 years has been orchestrated, funded, and managed by the Duchess. The Durham mines, the shipping routes to India, the textile factories in Manchester, even this estate's agricultural income. She restructured everything after your father's death, when the finances were in catastrophic disarray." Adrian felt the floor tilt. Why wasn't I informed? Thorne looked at him with something uncomfortably close to pity. "You were, Your Grace," repeatedly. You called the reports boring drivel and told me to summarize everything into one-page memos, which you rarely read. Adrian's hand curled into a fist. Then why the hell are accounts frozen now? Because the Duchess is no longer paying your debts. The words landed like a physical blow. Thorne continued, relentless now in the way desperate men become when they've already accepted they're going to be punished. She stopped 3 weeks ago, the exact day you made your announcement at the winter banquet. Since then, every carefully maintained financial structure she built has begun to collapse. Creditors who were patient because of her personal assurances are now demanding immediate payment. Investors who trusted her judgment are withdrawing. The Royal Bank, which extended extraordinary credit based solely on her reputation, has severed all ties. Adrian's mind raced. Where is she? The Duchess left the estate 18 days ago. She's taken residence at a private address in Mayfair. I'm told several prominent investors and members of Parliament have been seen visiting her new home. Visiting her? Adrian's voice cracked. Why the hell would they visit her? Thorne said nothing. Because the answer was obvious, because Evelyn Ashford Blackthorne wasn't the quiet, boring merchant's daughter Adrian had spent 6 years ignoring. She was the architect of everything he thought he owned. And now she was gone. Adrian fired Thorne that afternoon, not because the man was incompetent, but because keeping him meant accepting the information he'd delivered. Easier to eliminate the messenger than face the message. For 3 days, Adrian told himself it was all a misunderstanding. Evelyn was bitter, certainly, wounded. Women always were. But she'd come back. She had to. Where else would she go? What else did she have? On the 4th day, his solicitor arrived with divorce papers. Adrian read them in his study with a glass of brandy in one hand and growing fury in the other. The language was cold, precise, and devastating. Evelyn Ashford Blackthorne was formally dissolving the marriage. She sought no alimony, no settlement, no division of assets, because she already controlled all of them. The realization hit him like falling through ice. He wasn't rich anymore. He'd never been rich. She had been rich. And he'd been too arrogant to notice. Adrian threw the glass across the room. It shattered against the fireplace, brandy hissing on hot coals. Celeste appeared in the doorway, wrapped in an emerald dressing gown he'd bought her last month with money he apparently didn't have. Darling, I heard something break. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in weeks. She was beautiful, objectively, undeniably beautiful. But beauty, Adrian was beginning to understand, was the cheapest currency in the world. Get out, he said quietly. She blinked. What? Get out of my study. Get out of this house. Get out of my life. Her face transformed. Shock, then anger, then calculation so naked it made him sick. You can't be serious. I am entirely serious. Adrian. She moved toward him, hips swaying, voice dropping into the sultry register that used to make him stupid. You're upset. I understand, but we can fix this together. We're a team, remember? You said so yourself at the banquet. I was lying. The words came out flat. True. He'd been lying to her, to himself, to everyone, playing a role because it felt good and cost nothing. Except it had cost everything. He just hadn't known it yet. Celeste's expression hardened. Fine, she straightened. But I'm not leaving empty-handed. You owe me, Adrian, 2 years of my life, 2 years of putting up with your moods and your drinking and your pathetic need to prove you're better than your dead father. I want compensation. You want compensation, Adrian repeated slowly. £50,000. And the townhouse in Bath. He started laughing. Couldn't help it. The sound came out bitter and slightly unhinged. I don't have £50,000. I don't have the townhouse in Bath. I don't have anything, Celeste. It was never mine. Do you understand? None of it was ever mine. She stared at him like he'd grown a second head. Then she left. Not dramatically, not with tears or protests. She simply turned and walked away, and Adrian knew with absolute certainty he'd never see her again. Women like Celeste didn't stay when the money ran out. They were practical that way. He envied her, almost. At least she knew what she wanted and pursued it without pretense. Unlike him, Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of Nothing, sat alone in his study as afternoon light faded into evening. Somewhere in the house, servants moved quietly, probably discussing their uncertain futures. Somewhere in London, Evelyn was meeting with investors and politicians who respected her in ways they'd never respected him. And somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the anger and humiliation and disbelief, something small and terrible was beginning to take root. The understanding that he'd destroyed his own life and blamed everyone but himself for the rubble. So, the Royal Winter Assembly took place 6 weeks later in the grand ballroom of St. James's Palace. It was the social event of the season. 500 of England's most powerful families gathered under glittering chandeliers to eat too much, drink too much, and negotiate the future of empires between courses. Adrian almost didn't attend. His solicitor advised against it. His remaining servants begged him to reconsider. Even his mother, who'd barely spoken to him since the divorce papers became public, sent a terse note suggesting he stay home and avoid further embarrassment. But pride is a strange thing. It doesn't die easily. Sometimes it grows stronger in the face of destruction, feeding on desperation like fire feeds on air. Adrian told himself he'd go to the assembly and fix everything. He'd speak to the Crown's banking council, explain the misunderstanding, secure emergency funding. He was still a duke, damn it. Still bore one of the oldest names in England. That had to count for something. It counted for nothing. He realized that the moment he walked into the ballroom and conversation stopped. Not the polite kind of pause when someone important arrives. The ugly kind. The kind where people look at you the way they'd look at a street performer who wandered into the wrong building. Adrian forced himself to move forward. His evening clothes were still immaculate. He'd sold a few minor pieces of jewelry to pay the tailor, and he held his head high. Fake it, he thought. Fake it until it becomes real again. Except nothing was becoming real. Lord Pembroke turned away before Adrian could approach. Lady Worthington pretended sudden fascination with her champagne. Even young Baron Ashford, Evelyn's brother for God's sake, someone who should show family loyalty, met Adrian's gaze and shook his head slowly, almost sadly. Then Adrian saw her. Evelyn stood near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by men who mattered. Real men. The kind who built fortunes instead of inheriting them. She wore midnight blue silk that transformed her from pretty into something else entirely. Commanding, elegant, untouchable. Her hair was swept up, revealing the graceful line of her neck. Diamonds glittered at her throat. She was laughing at something Lord Haverford said. The Chancellor of the Exchequer stood at her elbow, looking at her with obvious admiration. Adrian felt something crack inside his chest. She looked happy. Worse, she looked free. He started toward her without thinking, driven by impulses he couldn't name. Anger, maybe. Desperation. The terrible need to prove he still mattered in some way to someone, even if that someone was the woman he'd humiliated. He made it halfway across the ballroom before someone intercepted him. Your Grace. Adrian turned. A thin man in austere black stood blocking his path. Gerard Wilmot, head of the Crown's elite banking council. The man who could approve or destroy financial futures with a single signature. Mr. Wilmot. Adrian forced a smile. I was hoping we might speak this evening about— We will speak, Wilmot interrupted, but not privately. Before Adrian could respond, Wilmot raised one hand. A signal. The musicians stopped playing. Conversation died. Every head in the ballroom turned toward them. Adrian's stomach dropped. What's happening? Wilmot's expression was completely neutral. You petitioned the council for emergency funding to restore Blackthorn's solvency. We've completed our investigation. The council feels the results should be shared publicly, given the unusual circumstances. That's not necessary, Adrian said quickly. Too quickly. We can discuss this in private, surely. The council disagrees. Two men appeared carrying a large portfolio. They set it on a nearby table and opened it, revealing stacks of documents, ledgers, and official correspondence. Wilmot's voice carried across the silent ballroom with terrible clarity. 6 years ago, Duke Adrian Blackthorn inherited an estate on the verge of bankruptcy. His father's investments had failed catastrophically. Debts exceeded assets by a factor of 3 to 1. Without immediate intervention, the Blackthorn name would have been erased from history within 18 months. Adrian felt 300 pairs of eyes fix on him. However, Wilmot continued, the estate did not collapse. Instead, it flourished. Coal mines were restructured, shipping routes expanded, new investments yielded extraordinary returns. Within 4 years, the Blackthorn fortune was not only restored but multiplied. A pause. The Duke would like us to believe this was his doing. Someone laughed. A short, ugly sound quickly stifled. Wilmot pulled a document from the portfolio. This is the operational transfer agreement signed by the Duke 6 years ago. It grants complete financial authority to Duchess Evelyn Ashford Blackthorne. She, not her husband, saved the estate. She negotiated with creditors, restructured debt, identified profitable ventures. Every success attributed to the Blackthorne name in the past 6 years was achieved by her intelligence, her work, and her reputation. Adrian's face burned. He wanted to speak, to object, to explain that it wasn't that simple. Except it was exactly that simple. Wilmot wasn't finished. The Duke, meanwhile, spent those 6 years spending money he didn't earn on luxuries he didn't need while publicly humiliating the woman who kept him solvent. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. No one moved, no one breathed. 3 weeks ago, the Duchess withdrew her support. Since then, every carefully maintained structure has collapsed. The Duke now owes approximately £400,000 to various creditors. He owns no profitable assets. Even the estate he currently occupies is held in trust under his wife's legal control. £400,000. The number crashed over Adrian like a wave. He'd known things were bad. He hadn't known they were impossible. Wilmot's next words were almost gentle. The Crown's Banking Council does not extend credit to men who destroy what others build. Your petition is denied, Your Grace. Adrian's voice came out hoarse. This is my family's name. Our legacy, your legacy, a new voice interrupted, is humiliation dressed as nobility. The crowd parted. Evelyn stepped forward. She moved with the calm, unhurried grace of someone who knew exactly how much power she held. When she stopped, she stood close enough that Adrian could see the cold fury in her eyes. Fury he'd never noticed before because he'd never bothered to look. You want to talk about legacy? Her voice was quiet, but carried through the ballroom like a bell. Let's talk about the coal mines you claimed to manage but never visited, the workers whose wages you cut to buy your mistress jewels, the investors I convinced to stay when you drove them away with your arrogance. Evelyn, I'm not finished. The command in her voice stopped him cold. You stood in our home 6 weeks ago and announced that your mistress would manage my household. My household, built with my money, maintained by my work, filled with people whose loyalty you purchased with my reputation. Her hands trembled slightly, the only sign of emotion breaking through her composure. I spent 6 years saving you from yourself, 6 years protecting a man too proud to see he was drowning, and the moment I stopped, you came here begging strangers to rescue you from consequences you created. Adrian felt something inside him crumble. I built the fortune, Evelyn said softly. I saved the estate. I protected the Blackthorne name when you were too drunk or distracted or self-absorbed to care. And now I'm done. She pulled a document from her reticule and held it up for the ballroom to see. This is my formal petition to dissolve our marriage and remove the Blackthorne family name from all remaining business contracts. Effective immediately, every asset I control will be transferred to my maiden name. The Ashford holdings will continue. The Blackthorne legacy ends here. The ballroom erupted. Not in gasps or whispers, in something uglier, the sound of 300 people simultaneously realizing they were watching a public execution. Adrian stared at the document in her hand. You can't do this. I already have. Evelyn, please. She stepped closer, close enough that only he could hear her next words. You humiliated me in front of everyone we know. You brought your mistress into my home and expected me to smile. You treated me like furniture for 6 years and never once asked what I wanted or needed or felt. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. Did you ever even like me, Adrian? The question landed like a knife between his ribs, because the answer was no. He'd never liked her, never tried to. She was a means to an end, respectability, connections, the social lubricant that made his life easier. He'd married her for what she represented, not who she was. And she'd known it the whole time. Evelyn stepped back. When she spoke again, her voice carried across the ballroom. The Crown's Banking Council has agreed to transfer oversight of Blackthorne debt resolution to independent arbitrators. The Duke will retain his title, but nothing else. His creditors will seize the estate within 30 days. She turned to leave. Adrian grabbed her arm without thinking. Wait. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face. And in her eyes, Adrian saw something worse than hatred. Pity. Let go of me. He did. She walked away. The ballroom remained silent as Eveline Ashford, no longer Blackthorn, departed through the main doors. The Chancellor of the Exchequer followed her, then Lord Haverford, then half the investors in the room. Adrian stood alone in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by people who wouldn't meet his eyes. And for the first time in his life, he understood what his father had tried to tell him years ago in one of those lectures Adrian had ignored. Power isn't what you inherit, it's what you earn. And if you can't tell the difference, you'll lose everything. Adrian had lost everything. He just didn't know how much further he had left to fall. The carriage ride back to Blackthorn Manor felt like traveling through a tunnel that kept getting narrower. Adrian sat alone in the darkness, watching London blur past the window. Gas lamps and fog, and the occasional face of someone who had no idea their world made sense. His world had stopped making sense somewhere between Eveline's final words and the moment he'd stood alone in that ballroom while 500 people pretended he'd disappeared. The estate gates appeared through the mist like teeth. He'd always loved those gates. Wrought iron, 12 feet tall, topped with the Blackthorn crest. A lion and a crown, symbols of power that went back 200 years. His father used to say the gates were the first thing visitors saw and the last thing they forgot. Tonight, they just looked like bars on a cage. The carriage stopped. Adrian climbed out without waiting for the footman. His legs felt unsteady. Not from drink, but from something worse. The vertigo that comes when the ground you've stood on your entire life turns out to be nothing but painted canvas over a pit. The manor's front doors opened before he reached them. Mrs. Heatherford stood in the entrance hall, the head housekeeper who'd served his family for 30 years. She was a severe woman, tall and thin, with gray hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She'd never liked Adrian. He'd known that since childhood, but she'd always been loyal to the Blackthorn name, which was supposed to be the same thing. Her face told him it wasn't. Your Grace. Her voice was flat. Professional. The tone you use with someone you're required to respect but don't. The staff has assembled in the servants' hall. They're requesting an audience. Adrian stopped. An audience? With me? Yes, Your Grace. Something in her expression made his stomach tighten. What do they want? I believe they'll tell you themselves. She turned and walked toward the back of the house without waiting to see if he'd follow. Adrian stood in the entrance hall, his entrance hall, in his house, on his property, and felt like a guest who'd overstayed his welcome. He followed her. The servants' hall was a long, narrow room in the manor's east wing where staff took meals and handled household business. Adrian had been inside maybe twice in his life, both times as a child when his father insisted he understand how the estate functioned. He'd found it boring then. He found it terrifying now. 23 people stood waiting. Maids, footmen, grooms, kitchen staff, groundskeepers. Every person who made Blackthorn Manor function while Adrian lived inside it like a parasite. They stood in a rough semicircle, faces ranging from nervous to angry to something worse, resigned. Mrs. Heatherford moved to the side, gestured for Adrian to step forward. He did, feeling absurdly like he was on trial. I understand you wanted to speak with me. Silence. Then Thomas Brennan stepped forward. The head groundskeeper, a broad man in his 50s with calloused hands and a face weathered by decades of outdoor work. He'd been employed by Adrian's father. Before that, by Adrian's grandfather. The Brennan family had maintained Blackthorn Gardens for 3 generations. Your Grace, Thomas said carefully, we've heard rumors about the estate, about what happened at the assembly. Rumors, Adrian repeated. His voice came out sharper than intended. And you're gathering like revolutionaries because of gossip? Not gossip, Your Grace. Fact. Thomas pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, unfolded it. This arrived this afternoon. Notice from the Crown's Banking Council. Says the estate's been seized pending debt resolution. Says all staff wages are suspended effective immediately. The words hit Adrian like physical blows. Suspended. He'd forgotten about wages. Forgotten that the 23 people staring at him depended on regular payment to feed their families, pay their rent, survive. In his world, money appeared when needed because it always had. In their world, money was the difference between living and starving. That's a mistake, he said. I'll have my solicitor. Your solicitor quit yesterday, Mrs. Heatherford interrupted. Sent a letter, said you hadn't paid him in 4 months. Adrian's mind raced. 4 months? That couldn't be right. Except it was right because Evelyn had been paying the solicitor, just like she'd been paying everyone. And now she wasn't. I'll find a new solicitor, he said. I'll sort this out. Just give me… Time? A new voice. Sarah Mills, one of the younger maids. She couldn't have been more than 20. You want us to give you time while our families go hungry? I didn't create this situation. Yes, you did. The room went very still. Thomas spoke again, quieter now, but somehow more devastating. The Duchess came here last week, spoke to all of us privately, offered us positions in her new household in London. Good positions. Better wages than we're getting here. Better treatment. Adrian felt cold spreading through his chest. She came here? To my house? Her house, Your Grace. Legally speaking, Mrs. Heatherford's voice was ice. She owned it before she left. She owns it now. You've been living in her property on her sufferance. The world tilted. And we're taking her offer, Thomas continued. All of us. We leave tomorrow morning. 23 heads nodded in unison. Adrian looked at their faces and saw no guilt, no apology, just the cold mathematics of survival. They were abandoning him because staying meant going down with a sinking ship, captained by a man who'd never learned to navigate. You can't, he said, and hated how desperate he sounded. This is Blackthorn Manor. My family… Your family is dead, Your Grace. Mrs. Heatherford stepped forward. Your father is gone. Your mother wants nothing to do with you. The Duchess has left. You're what remains, and what remains isn't enough to build loyalty on. She pulled an envelope from her apron and set it on the table between them. Our formal resignations, effective immediately. The manor will be locked and secured tonight. You have until morning to gather your personal belongings. Adrian stared at the envelope like it was a live snake. Where am I supposed to go? Nobody answered. Because nobody cared. They filed out one by one, taking with them the last pretense that Adrian Blackthorn was anything more than a title attached to a man who'd squandered everything that title once meant. The servants' hall emptied. Adrian stood alone in the silence, and for the first time since childhood, he cried. Not gracefully, not quietly. He cried the way men cry when they finally understand they've destroyed something they can never rebuild. Harsh, ugly sobs that tore out of his chest and echoed off bare walls. He cried until he couldn't anymore. Then he walked upstairs to the bedroom he'd slept in since birth and started packing. Book. The townhouse in Belgravia had been his mother's property, a wedding gift from his father that she'd held on to after becoming widowed. It was smaller than the manor, only 12 rooms instead of 40, but still elegant in that particularly English way. High ceilings, tasteful wallpaper, furniture that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Adrian's mother, Dowager Duchess Margaret Blackthorn, received him in the drawing room with all the warmth of a creditor reviewing a defaulted loan. She was 62 but looked younger, the kind of woman who treated aging like an opponent to be defeated through sheer force of will. Her silver hair was immaculately styled. Her posture was perfect. Her eyes, when they fixed on Adrian, contained nothing resembling maternal affection. You look terrible, she said. Adrian stood in the doorway holding a single trunk containing everything he'd managed to salvage from the manor. His evening clothes from the assembly were wrinkled. He hadn't slept. He probably smelled. Thank you for seeing me. I didn't have a choice. She gestured to a chair. Sit down before you fall over. He sat. Margaret poured tea from a silver service with movements so precise they looked choreographed. I assume you're here because you have nowhere else to go. Yes. And you expect me to take you in. I'm your son. You're a disappointment. She handed him a teacup. There's a difference. The words should have hurt. They didn't. Adrian had moved past hurt into the numb territory beyond it. I need help, he said simply. You need more than help. You need a miracle. Margaret sat across from him, tea balanced on her knee. The entire city is talking about what happened at the assembly. The papers are calling it the scandal of the decade. 3 different political cartoonists have drawn you as a jester holding an empty crown. Adrian's jaw tightened. I'm aware. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, you seem remarkably unaware of most things. She sipped her tea. Your father warned me this would happen. The night before he died, he told me you didn't have the spine to carry the family forward. I defended you. I said you just needed time to mature. I was young. You were lazy. The correction came sharp and fast. Young men can be forgiven many things. Laziness isn't one of them. You inherited an empire and treated it like a toy. You married a brilliant woman and treated her like wallpaper. And now you're here, in my home, asking me to fix what you broke. Adrian set down his teacup before he threw it. What would you have me do, grovel? Apologize to people who've already made up their minds about me? I'd have you grow up. Margaret leaned forward. But I suspect it's too late for that. So you're refusing to help me. I'm refusing to enable you. She stood, smoothing her skirt. You can stay here for 2 weeks. That's all. Use that time to find employment, secure lodging, and figure out how to survive without a title or money or anyone willing to bail you out. After 2 weeks, you leave. I don't care where you go. Adrian felt something sharp and hot rising in his throat. You're my mother. I'm the woman who gave birth to you, Margaret corrected. Mothers nurture their children. I'm done nurturing. You're 31 years old and you've accomplished nothing except destroying the legacy 3 generations of Blackthorns built. I won't waste what remains of my life watching you fail. She walked to the door, paused. Eveline came to see me last week. Adrian's head snapped up. What? We had tea, talked for 2 hours. She's a remarkable woman, Adrian. Intelligent, capable, stronger than I gave her credit for. Margaret's voice softened slightly. She asked if I thought you could change, if there was anything in you worth salvaging. What did you tell her? I said I didn't know. Margaret met his eyes. And I still don't. She left. Adrian sat alone in the drawing room of his mother's house and felt the last threads of his old life snap like rotted rope. Wag. Employment, Adrian discovered, was humiliating. Not the concept of working, though that was foreign enough, but the process. The interviews, the rejections, the thinly veiled contempt from men who would have prostrated themselves before him 6 months ago. He tried the gentlemen's clubs first, thinking his connections might translate into something useful. They didn't. The clubs were filled with men who remembered him as the duke who'd publicly humiliated his wife and bankrupted his estate. They smiled at him the way you smile at a leper, polite but distant, already planning their escape. Lord Haverford cut him in the street. Baron Sheffield pretended not to recognize him. Even young Percy Ashford, Evelyn's brother, who Adrian had known since the boy was 16, turned away without a word when they crossed paths near Parliament. The message was clear. Adrian Blackthorn was no longer part of their world. He tried businesses next. Shipping companies, investment firms, any place that might value his name despite his reputation. The interviews followed a predictable pattern. Duke Blackthorn. What an unexpected pleasure. Smiles that didn't reach eyes. Offers of tea that came with expiration dates. We're not hiring at present. Your qualifications are impressive, but we need someone with more practical experience. Perhaps try the East India Company. They take all sorts. The subtext was obvious. We don't want you. Nobody wants you. Go away. After 2 weeks, Adrian had one job offer. Harold Grimsby ran a textile warehouse in Southwark, the kind of place where poor families bought cheap fabric and poorer families worked 14-hour days turning cotton into cloth. The building smelled like sweat and machine oil. The workers looked at Adrian like he was a creature from another planet. Grimsby himself was a short, round man with stained fingers and the expression of someone perpetually calculating profit margins. You'll be managing inventory, he said, leading Adrian through the warehouse. Tracking shipments, supervising the floor workers, handling customer complaints. 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. £2 per week. £2. Adrian had spent more than that on a single dinner 6 months ago. That seems low, he said carefully. It's what I'm offering. Grimsby stopped, turned. You want the position or not? Adrian looked around the warehouse. 50 people working in cramped conditions for wages that barely covered rent. Women with tired eyes and children with no shoes. The future he'd never thought he'd have to face. I'll take it, Grimsby nodded. Start Monday. The work was harder than anything Adrian had done in his life. Not physically, though standing for 10 hours straight made his legs ache in ways he hadn't known possible, but mentally. The constant vigilance, the endless small decisions, the responsibility for systems he'd never thought about before. Inventory meant numbers, thousands of them. Shipments arriving, fabric leaving, costs fluctuating, workers needing materials, customers demanding products. Adrian had to track it all in ledgers that made his eyes blur. He was terrible at it. "You marked this shipment as complete," Grimsby said on the third day, shoving a manifest at Adrian's chest. "But we're missing 2 full bolts of cotton. That's 8 pounds of lost product. Where'd it go?" Adrian stared at the manifest. The numbers swam. "I don't know. You don't know." Grimsby's voice rose. "Your job is to know. That's why I hired you. That's what I'm paying you for. I'm doing my best." "Your best isn't good enough." Grimsby grabbed the manifest back. "Figure it out by tomorrow or you're finished." Adrian spent that night sitting in his small rented room, a shabby space in Whitechapel that cost 18 shillings a week, going through shipping records by candlelight. His eyes burned, his head pounded. The numbers refused to make sense. He found the missing cotton at 2 in the morning, a clerical error, a shipment marked as delivered when it was still in transit. Simple mistake. The kind Eveline probably would have spotted in 30 seconds. Eveline. He wondered what she was doing right now. Probably sleeping in silk sheets in some elegant townhouse, surrounded by people who respected her, people who saw her value and didn't take it for granted. Adrian had taken everything for granted. The job lasted 3 weeks. Grimsby fired him on a Tuesday morning after Adrian miscalculated payroll and accidentally shorted 12 workers a day's wages. The workers nearly rioted. Grimsby had to pay them from his own pocket to keep them from walking out. "You're done," he said flatly. "Get out." Adrian left with 14 pounds in his pocket and no prospects. Poverty comes in stages. First, you sell the valuable things. Adrian sold his watch, a gold piece from Switzerland that had belonged to his grandfather. Got 70 pounds for it, enough to pay rent for 3 months if he was careful. He wasn't careful. Then you sell the sentimental things. His father's cufflinks, his mother's gift from his 18th birthday. Books he'd never read but kept anyway. Each sale felt like amputating pieces of his past. Then you start making choices. Food or coal for heat. Rent or new shoes when the old ones develop holes. Pride or survival. Adrian chose survival mostly, but pride kept bleeding through in stupid ways. He'd skip meals rather than eat at the charity kitchens where the truly desperate gathered. He'd walk 5 miles in the rain rather than take cheap public transport. He'd lie to the landlord about having a job rather than admit he was unemployed. The lies got harder to maintain. By the 4th month after the assembly, Adrian was living in a boarding house in Spitalfields that cost 9 shillings a week and came with bedbugs. His room was 8 feet square. The walls were so thin he could hear his neighbors breathing. The window looked onto a brick wall. He'd lost weight. His clothes hung loose. His face had developed the gaunt, hollowed look of someone who wasn't eating enough. He'd become invisible, not metaphorically. Literally invisible in the way poor people are invisible to the rich. He could walk past men he'd known his entire life, and they wouldn't see him. Their eyes would slide over him like he was part of the scenery. One afternoon, he passed Lord Pembroke on Fleet Street. Pembroke had been at his wedding, had attended probably 50 dinners at Blackthorn Manor, had called Adrian old friend countless times. Their eyes met for half a second. Pembroke looked away, kept walking, didn't recognize him. Adrian stood on the corner for 5 minutes afterward, watching people flow past, and understood something fundamental. He'd never existed to these people. Only his title had existed. Only his money. Strip those away and he was nothing, less than nothing. He was the absence where something important used to be. That night he sat in his boarding house room with a knife in his hand. Not a good knife, a cheap thing he'd bought at a market for 3 pence, but sharp enough. He thought about his father, about legacy and honor and all the speeches he'd ignored, about Eveline, who'd tried to save him from himself and gotten destroyed for it, about the servants who'd left without looking back, about his mother, who'd given him 2 weeks and not a day more, about the fact that at 31 years old, he had nothing and was nothing and would probably die nothing. The knife felt heavy. Outside, someone was singing, drunk, probably, the kind of formless warbling that came from people who'd given up on dignity. Adrian set the knife down, not out of hope, not out of some sudden realization that life was worth living, but out of spite. The same stubborn pride that had destroyed him now kept him breathing. He refused to give the world the satisfaction of his death. If he was going to fail, he'd fail on his feet. Dunce. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Adrian almost missed it. The boarding house didn't have proper mail service. Letters got shoved under the front door and anyone could take them. But this one had his name on it in handwriting he didn't recognize. Expensive paper, wax seal. He opened it in his room. Mr. Blackthorne, it began. Not your grace. That title was gone. I represent certain parties interested in your situation. We have a business proposition that may benefit both parties. Please attend a meeting at the address below at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon. Come alone. Dress appropriately. No signature. Just an address in Mayfair and a time. Adrian read it 3 times looking for the trap. This was how people got robbed or murdered. Mysterious invitations to unknown addresses. But the paper was real. The seal looked legitimate. And most importantly, he had nothing worth stealing anymore. Friday afternoon found him standing outside a townhouse in one of London's wealthiest neighborhoods. 3 stories, white stone, iron fence, the kind of place he used to visit without thinking twice. Now he felt like a trespasser. He knocked. A butler answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting. Mr. Blackthorne, please come in. The interior was elegant without being ostentatious. Good furniture, expensive art, the smell of money that knew it didn't need to announce itself. The butler led him to a study on the 2nd floor. 3 men waited inside. Adrian recognized 2 of them immediately. Marcus Webb, a shipping magnate who controlled half the merchant routes to India. Thomas Caldwell, an investor who'd made a fortune in railways. The 3rd man he didn't know, older, sharp-eyed, dressed in gray. Webb gestured to a chair. Sit down, Mr. Blackthorne. Adrian sat. What's this about? Business, Caldwell said. We've been watching you. Watching me? For months. The 3rd man spoke for the first time. His voice was rough, like he'd spent years smoking cheap tobacco. Ever since the assembly. You've had quite a fall, I'm aware. Are you? Webb leaned forward. Because from where we sit, you don't seem aware of much. You took a bad situation and made it worse. Lost a job at a textile warehouse because you couldn't manage basic arithmetic. Nearly got evicted twice. You're living like a rat in Spitalfields when 6 months ago you had everything. Adrian's hands curled into fists. Is there a point to this? The point, Caldwell said, is that we're offering you a way out. Silence. Why? Adrian asked flatly. The 3rd man smiled. Because you're useful. Not your title. That's worthless now. Not your name. That's poison. But you. Adrian Blackthorne the man. You have access to places we don't. Connections, even if they're failing. Knowledge about how the aristocracy operates. And you want what, exactly? Information, Webb said. Names, secrets. The kind of things men say when they think they're among friends. You attend the right parties, hear the right conversations, and report back to us. In exchange, we pay you enough to live comfortably. Not extravagantly, but comfortably. Adrian looked at the 3 of them. You want me to spy on my own class? Your former class, Caldwell corrected. They abandoned you, remember? Left you to rot the moment you couldn't pay your bills. This is just evening the score. It's betrayal. It's survival, the 3rd man said, and survival is the only thing that matters when you're drowning. The words hit harder than they should have. Adrian thought about the boarding house, the hunger, the invisibility, the knife he'd held and set down, the absolute certainty that if he refused this offer, he'd be dead within a year. If not by his own hand, then by disease or starvation or simple hopelessness. How much? He asked. Webb smiled. £20 a month to start. More if you provide valuable intelligence. £20. More than Adrian had seen in 3 months combined. And if I refuse, then you leave, the 3rd man said. And you keep drowning. We'll find someone else. There's always someone desperate enough. The study went quiet. Outside, carriages passed on the street. Wealthy people going to wealthy places to do wealthy things. The world Adrian used to inhabit before it spit him out. He could refuse. Keep his dignity. Starve with honor, or he could survive. I'll do it, Adrian said. The 3 men exchanged glances. Webb pulled out a contract. Sign here. Adrian took the pen. His hand shook slightly as he wrote his name. Not Duke Adrian Blackthorne. Just Adrian. The man who'd sold everything else was now selling the last thing he had left. Himself. The work was simpler than Adrian expected. For the first month, Webb and his associates wanted nothing complicated. Just names. Who attended which parties, who spoke to whom. What business deals were being discussed over cigars and brandy in rooms Adrian could still access because nobody thought to exclude a ghost. He was good at being a ghost now. Adrian had learned to dress just well enough not to attract attention. Worn but respectable clothing purchased from second-hand shops, carefully maintained to look like a gentleman down on his luck rather than a spy. He'd learned to listen without appearing to listen, to remember conversations without taking notes, to smile and nod and fade into wallpaper the way Evelyn used to. The irony wasn't lost on him. Every 2 weeks he met Webb in the same Mayfair townhouse, delivered his reports, collected his payment, 20 pounds in cash that kept him fed and housed and functional. It felt like selling pieces of his soul one coin at a time, but souls, Adrian had discovered, were less important than rent. The information he provided was mostly harmless. Lord Pembroke was considering investing in a new railway line. Baron Sheffield's daughter was engaged to a merchant's son. The Duke of Somerset had lost heavily at cards and was looking to sell property. Webb took notes, thanked him, sent him back into the world. Then, in the 3rd month, everything changed. The meeting happened on a Tuesday evening. Adrian arrived at the townhouse expecting the usual routine: report, payment, dismissal. Instead, he found Webb alone in the study, standing by the window with his back to the door. Something about his posture made Adrian's instincts scream. Webb turned. His expression was different, harder. "Where's Caldwell?" Adrian asked. "Not here." Webb gestured to a chair. "Sit down." Adrian remained standing. "What's this about?" Webb pulled a photograph from his desk drawer and slid it across the polished surface. Adrian looked at it and felt his blood turn to ice. The photograph showed Evelyn. She was seated at an outdoor cafe, smiling at someone across the table. The angle suggested the photographer had been hiding, capturing the moment without her knowledge. "Where did you get this?" Adrian's voice came out hoarse. "We've been watching her," Webb said calmly. "For months. Ever since she left you. Tracking her movements, her meetings, her business dealings. Why? Because she's become a problem." Webb leaned against the desk. "Your former wife controls shipping routes we need. She's negotiating contracts with competitors that will cost us millions. She's also very careful, paranoid even. Doesn't trust easily, doesn't make mistakes." Adrian's hands curled into fists. "What does this have to do with me? You're going to help us get close to her." The words hung in the air like poison. "No." Webb's expression didn't change. "That wasn't a request." "I don't care." Adrian's voice rose. "I'm not helping you hurt her. We're not going to hurt her. We're going to ruin her. Financially, professionally, the way she ruined you." Webb pulled out another photograph. This one showed Evelyn entering a bank. "And you're going to provide the information we need to do it. Go to hell." Webb sighed, picked up a folder from his desk, opened it. Inside were documents, contracts, signed agreements, all bearing Adrian's name. "Do you remember what you signed when you took this job?" Webb asked conversationally. "A contract for information. A contract that explicitly states you'll provide any intelligence we request regarding targets we designate. Refusal constitutes breach of contract, and breach carries consequences." He slid one of the documents toward Adrian. It was a confession, pre-written, dated, waiting only for distribution. It detailed how Adrian Blackthorne had been selling aristocratic secrets to criminal enterprises for months, how he'd betrayed confidences, violated trusts, engaged in espionage against his own class. Every word was true. "If this gets out," Webb said quietly, "you'll never work again. Not in London, not anywhere. The few people who still tolerate you will turn their backs completely. You'll be branded a traitor, and traitors don't survive long in our world." Adrian stared at the confession. His own words, his own signature twisted into a weapon aimed at his throat. "You planned this from the beginning," he said slowly. "Of course we did." Webb smiled. Did you really think we wanted you for your sparkling conversation? You're useful because you're desperate, and desperate men are easy to control. The room felt like it was shrinking. What do you want? Adrian asked. Access. Webb sat down, completely relaxed now. Evelyn is hosting a charity gala next month. Major investors, politicians, business leaders. Very exclusive, very secure. She won't let anyone near her she doesn't trust completely. And you think she trusts me? No. But you're her former husband. If you show up looking repentant, broken, begging for forgiveness, she might feel pity. Might let you in just to prove she's moved on. Webb leaned forward. Once you're inside, you plant this. He pulled a small device from his pocket. Metal, no bigger than a coin. What is it? Listening device. Plant it somewhere in the venue. Her office, if you can manage it. We'll handle the rest. Adrian looked at the device, at the confession, at Webb's face, which showed no guilt, no shame, nothing but cold calculation. This was what survival looked like. This was where every compromise led. You sold a little piece of yourself and told yourself it didn't matter. Then you sold another piece. And another. Until you looked down and realized there was nothing left to sell except the last shred of humanity you'd been clinging to. And if I refuse? Adrian asked quietly. Then we release the confession. Webb shrugged. You'll be destroyed. Again. Completely this time. No coming back. Either way, I'm destroyed. True. Webb stood. But this way you get paid, £20,000. Enough to leave London. Start over somewhere else. Become someone new. The number echoed in Adrian's skull. £20,000. More money than he'd seen in a year. Freedom. Escape. All he had to do was betray the one person who'd never actually betrayed him. Evelyn hadn't destroyed him. She'd removed her support and let him collapse under his own weight. There was a difference. She'd built an empire while he played king. She'd saved him repeatedly while he humiliated her publicly. And when she finally left, she'd done it with more grace than he deserved. Now he was being asked to repay her mercy with treachery. I need time to think, Adrian said. You have 24 hours. Webb opened the door. After that, we make our own arrangements and release the confession as a bonus. What? Adrian walked for hours after leaving the townhouse. Through Mayfair, where wealthy families lived in comfortable ignorance. Through Soho, where artists and criminals occupied the same buildings. Through Whitechapel, where poverty stripped away pretense and left only survival. His mind kept circling the same questions. Who was he now? What did he owe anyone? What was left of the man he used to be? The man he used to be was a joke, an entitled aristocrat who thought the world existed to serve him. That man had destroyed everything he touched, but this new man, this desperate, hungry, compromised thing he'd become, was worse. At least the old Adrian had been honestly terrible. This version was terrible and pathetic. He found himself outside Evelyn's new residence near midnight. It was an elegant townhouse in Bloomsbury, 4 stories of white stone with gas lamps burning in the windows. Through the glass he could see movement. Servants, probably. Or maybe Evelyn herself, working late the way she always had. She'd saved him so many times and he'd never noticed, never thanked her, never even acknowledged that the life he'd been living was built entirely on her competence. And now he was going to destroy her to save himself. The thought made him physically ill. Adrian turned away from the townhouse and kept walking. Not toward anything, just away. Bochek. The decision came at dawn. Adrian sat in his boarding house room as gray light crept through the filthy window. He hadn't slept. His mind felt raw, scraped clean of everything except one cold truth. He couldn't do it. Not because of morality, not because of guilt. Those were luxuries he'd lost months ago. But because betraying Evelyn would make him exactly what Webb thought he was. A tool. A weapon without will. A thing that could be pointed at any target and fired without hesitation. If he did this, he'd never be anything else. The confession would destroy him. He knew that. Webb would release it, and Adrian's name would become synonymous with treachery. The few people who still acknowledged his existence would turn away. He'd be truly alone, but at least he'd still be himself, whatever that meant anymore. He went to the meeting at the designated time, walked into the Mayfair townhouse for what he knew would be the last time. Webb was waiting. So were Caldwell and the third man, whose name Adrian had never learned. Well? Webb asked. Adrian took a breath. I'm not doing it. The room went very quiet. Webb's expression didn't change. You understand what that means? Yes. You'll be ruined. I'm already ruined. Caldwell laughed. A short, ugly sound. You're making a mistake, boy. You think refusing makes you noble? It just makes you stupid. Maybe, Adrian said, but it's my choice to make. The third man spoke for the first time. His voice was soft, almost sad. We gave you a way out. You chose pride instead. That's on you. Webb pulled the confession from his desk drawer. By tomorrow morning, every newspaper in London will have a copy of this. Every club, every business. Everyone who still tolerates your presence will know exactly what you've been doing. Adrian nodded. I know, and you're fine with that. No. Adrian's voice cracked slightly. I'm not fine with any of this, but I'm done making deals that cost more than I can afford. Webb stared at him for a long moment. Then he slid the confession into an envelope and sealed it. Get out. Adrian left. He walked out of the townhouse, down the steps, onto the street. The morning was cold. Fog rolled between buildings like smoke. Behind him, he heard the door close with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid. The confession hit the papers the next morning. The fallen Duke's final betrayal, the Times headline screamed. Blackthorne sold secrets to criminal syndicate. The story spread like fire through dry grass. By noon, every gentleman's club in London had banned him. By evening, his landlord had evicted him. Adrian spent that night sleeping in a church doorway in Southwark. Not because he wanted to, because he had nowhere else to go. The cold settled into his bones. His stomach ached from hunger. But his mind felt strangely clear. He'd made a choice. A real one. Not because it would save him or benefit him or lead anywhere good, but because it was the only choice that didn't require him to become something he couldn't live with. That had to count for something, even if it counted for nothing else. Evelyn found him 3 days later. Adrian was sitting on a bench near the Thames, watching ships move up and down the river. He'd sold his last decent coat that morning for enough money to buy bread. His hands were shaking from cold. He didn't hear her approach, didn't realize she was there until she spoke. Adrian. His head snapped up. She stood a few feet away, dressed in deep blue wool with a fur collar. Her hair was pinned up beneath a small hat. She looked warm, healthy, successful. She looked like everything he wasn't. Evelyn, he said hoarsely. She sat down on the bench beside him. Not close. Carefully maintaining distance. For a long moment, neither spoke. I read the papers, she said finally. Adrian laughed bitterly. Everyone did. Webb came to see me. His stomach dropped. What? Yesterday. She kept her eyes on the river. He told me you were supposed to spy on me. Plant listening devices at my gala. He was very angry that you refused. Adrian closed his eyes. I'm sorry. Are you? He looked at her, really looked at her, saw the wariness in her posture, the careful neutrality in her expression. She didn't trust him. Why would she? He'd given her no reason to. Yes, he said quietly. For everything. For how I treated you. For taking you for granted. For being too stupid and arrogant to see what you were doing while I destroyed everything you built. For all of it. Evelyn's jaw tightened. You humiliated me in front of everyone we knew. I know. You brought your mistress into my home and expected me to smile. I know. You treated me like I was invisible. I know. Adrian's voice broke. I know, and I'm sorry. It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't change what I did. But I'm sorry. She was quiet for a long time. Webb offered me a deal, she said eventually. He said if I gave him certain shipping contracts, he'd make your confession disappear, restore some of your reputation. Adrian's breath caught. What did you tell him? I told him to go to hell. Her voice was cold. You made your choices. You lived with the consequences. I'm not saving you again. The words should have hurt. They didn't. They were fair. I wouldn't have let you anyway, Adrian said, even if you'd wanted to. Why not? Because you were right. He looked at his hands, raw and chapped from cold. I spent my whole life letting other people fix my mistakes. My father, my mother, you. I never learned to stand on my own because I never had to, and look where it got me. Evelyn studied his face. You look terrible. I feel terrible. Good. He almost smiled. She didn't. Why are you here? He asked. He did. I don't know. You stood, brushing invisible lint from her skirt. I saw you sitting here, and I don't know. Curiosity, maybe. Wanted to see if there was anything left of the man I married. Is there? Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. I honestly don't know, she said, but I think you're finally starting to ask the right questions. She turned to leave. Evelyn, Adrian called. She paused. Thank you for everything you did. When we were married, I never said it then. I'm saying it now. Her shoulders stiffened slightly, then relaxed. You're welcome, she said quietly, and then she walked away. Adrian watched her disappear into the crowd of afternoon pedestrians, watched until he couldn't distinguish her from anyone else. Then he stood up. His legs were unsteady. His body was weak from hunger and cold and exhaustion. His future was a blank space filled with uncertainty. But for the first time in his life, he was standing on his own. No title propping him up, no money cushioning his falls, no one to blame but himself. He started walking, not toward anything in particular, just forward. The winter of 1848 was brutal. London froze solid. The Thames turned to ice. People died in the streets from cold and starvation and diseases that thrived in poverty. Adrian survived. Barely. But he survived. He found work where he could. Day labor mostly, loading crates at the docks, shoveling coal, anything that paid enough to keep him fed and housed in progressively cheaper rooms. The work was backbreaking. His hands developed calluses. His back ached constantly. He lost more weight until his clothes hung on him like sails on a mast. But something strange happened as the months passed. He started to feel almost human again. Not happy, not fulfilled, but present, aware. Like he'd been sleepwalking through his entire life and finally woken up to discover the world was harder and uglier and more real than he'd ever imagined. The men he worked with didn't care that he used to be a duke. They cared whether he could lift his share of the weight, whether he showed up on time, whether he pulled his own. For the first time in his life, Adrian had to prove his worth through action instead of title. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. One afternoon in March, he was working at the docks when a supervisor approached him. You Blackthorn? Adrian looked up from the crate he was loading. Yeah. The supervisor handed him an envelope. This came for you. Adrian took it with hands still rough from rope burn. The envelope was good paper, sealed with wax. His first thought was web, another threat, another demand. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single page, plain handwriting, no signature. There's a position available at Ashford Maritime. Inventory management. The pay is fair. The work is honest. If you're interested, present yourself Monday morning at the address below. Ask for Robert Ashford, Evelyn's brother. Adrian stared at the letter for a full minute. This was a test, obviously. Evelyn was giving him a chance to prove he'd changed, or maybe she was just being kind to someone who didn't deserve kindness. He couldn't tell. Either way, it was more than he'd earned. He folded the letter carefully, put it in his pocket. Monday morning, he'd go to the address. He'd take the job if they offered it. He'd work harder than he'd ever worked in his life. Not to win Evelyn back. That ship had sailed and sunk and been forgotten by everyone except him, but to prove to himself that he could be something other than the hollow shell of a man who'd destroyed everything he touched. Whether that would be enough, he didn't know. But it was a start. And starts, Adrian had learned, were all anyone really got. The rest you had to build yourself, one painful, uncertain step at a time. The Ashford Maritime offices occupied 3 floors of a brick building near the London docks. Adrian arrived at dawn on Monday, dressed in the cleanest clothes he owned, a shirt he'd washed himself in a basin, trousers that had been mended twice, boots with cardboard stuffed inside to cover the holes in the soles. He looked like what he was, a man barely surviving. The receptionist stared at him like he'd crawled out of the Thames. I'm here to see Robert Ashford, Adrian said. About the inventory position. She looked him up and down with unconcealed skepticism. Your name? Adrian Blackthorne. Her expression shifted. Recognition, then something harder. Distaste, maybe? Or pity? Hard to tell which was worse. Wait here. She disappeared up a staircase. Adrian stood in the lobby, acutely aware of how he must look, how he must smell. 6 months of poverty had stripped away every pretense of gentility. He was a ghost of the man who used to command rooms without effort. Now he couldn't even command respect from a receptionist. Robert Ashford appeared 10 minutes later. Eveline's younger brother was 26, tall and lean, with the same sharp intelligence in his eyes that his sister had. He'd always been polite to Adrian during the marriage. Distant, but polite. The kind of tolerance you show a family member you don't particularly like but can't avoid. Now he looked at Adrian like he was examining a stray dog. Follow me. They climbed 2 flights of stairs to a cramped office overlooking the docks. Through the window, Adrian could see ships being loaded, workers moving like ants across wooden piers. The room smelled like salt water and old paper. Robert sat behind a desk, didn't offer Adrian a chair. My sister asked me to meet with you, he said flatly. I want you to know I argued against it. Adrian remained standing. I understand. Do you? Robert leaned back. Because from where I'm sitting, you don't understand much. You destroyed your own life, humiliated my sister publicly, spent 6 years treating her like property, and now you're here looking for charity. I'm looking for work. Why should I give it to you? The question hung in the air. Adrian had thought about this, had rehearsed answers during the long walk from his boarding house, but all the rehearsed words felt hollow now. You shouldn't, he said finally. I don't deserve it. I haven't earned it, and I can't promise I won't fail. Robert's eyebrow raised slightly. That's your pitch? It's the truth. Adrian met his eyes. I could lie. Tell you I've changed, that I've learned my lesson, that I'll work harder than anyone. But you'd see through it. So instead, I'll tell you this. I have nothing left. No title that means anything, no money, no connections, just hands that can work and a brain that's finally starting to function. If you give me this job, I'll do it to the best of my ability. If I fail, fire me. But at least give me the chance to fail on my own merit instead of my reputation. Robert studied him for a long moment. The position pays £12 a month, he said. You'll track shipments, manage inventory logs, coordinate with dock workers. The hours are dawn to dusk, 6 days a week. The work is tedious and thankless. Most men quit within 3 months. I won't quit. We'll see. Robert pulled a contract from his desk. You start tomorrow. Be here at 5 in the morning. If you're late, don't bother coming back. Adrian took the contract. Read it quickly. Signed. Thank you. Don't thank me. Robert's voice was cold. Thank my sister. She's the one who insisted. God knows why. Yepoka. The work was exactly as tedious as Robert promised. Adrian spent his days in a windowless basement office, hunched over ledgers that tracked every crate, barrel, and bolt of fabric moving through Ashford Maritime's docks. Each shipment had to be logged, verified, cross-referenced against purchase orders. Mistakes cost money. Money cost jobs. He made mistakes, plenty of them. The first week he miscounted a textile shipment and nearly caused a customer to cancel a major order. Robert caught the error at the last minute and chewed Adrian out in front of the entire office staff. You're lucky I check your work, he said icily. Next time I won't. Adrian apologized. Stayed late that night rechecking every entry in the ledger. Found 3 more errors. Corrected them. The second week he got into an argument with a dock foreman who insisted a shipment had arrived when Adrian's record showed it hadn't. The foreman was loud, aggressive, used to intimidating desk workers. Adrian held his ground, showed him the documentation, refused to back down even when the man got in his face. The foreman turned out to be wrong. The shipment was still on a ship 2 miles down the river. Robert called Adrian into his office afterward. You handled that well, he said grudgingly. Most men would have folded. I've had practice standing my ground. Robert almost smiled. Almost. Keep it up. The months blurred together. Spring turned to summer. Adrian fell into a rhythm that was equal parts exhausting and stabilizing. Wake at 4, walk to the docks, work until dark, return to his boarding house, sleep, repeat. It wasn't the life he'd imagined at 31. It was barely a life at all. But it was his. Nobody else was building it. Nobody else was maintaining it. For the first time since childhood, Adrian was responsible for his own survival. No safety net, no fallback plan, just work and consequences. And somewhere in that grinding repetition, something unexpected happened. He got good at it. The numbers started making sense. The patterns emerged. He learned to anticipate problems before they occurred, to spot discrepancies in shipping manifests that saved the company thousands of pounds. Robert noticed. By autumn, Adrian had been promoted to senior inventory manager. The pay increased to £18 a month, enough to move out of the boarding house into a small rented room that had actual furniture and windows that closed properly. It wasn't luxury, but it was progress. He saw Evelyn exactly once during those months. It was October, late afternoon, and Adrian was walking near Covent Garden after finishing a meeting with a supplier. The streets were crowded with people leaving work, vendors closing shops, the usual chaos of London at dusk. He almost didn't recognize her. She stood outside a bookshop, examining something in the window display. She wore deep green wool and a small hat with a feather. Her face looked relaxed in a way he'd never seen during their marriage. She looked happy. Adrian stopped walking, stood there on the crowded sidewalk watching her the way you might watch something beautiful and fragile that you'd broken and could never repair. Part of him wanted to approach her, say something, prove he was different now. But he wasn't that different. He was just less broken, less destructive, less toxic. That wasn't the same as being good enough. Evelyn glanced up from the window. Their eyes met across 30 feet of crowded street. For a moment, neither moved. Then she nodded. A small, polite acknowledgement. The kind you give an acquaintance you recognize but don't particularly want to talk to. Adrian nodded back. She turned and walked into the bookshop. He stood there for another minute, then continued walking. His chest felt tight. Not with longing, exactly. More like grief for something that had never really existed in the first place. He'd married her for convenience and treated her like furniture. She'd loved him anyway, or tried to, until love became impossible under the weight of his contempt. Now she was thriving without him, and he was learning to exist without destroying everything he touched. That was probably the best outcome anyone could hope for. The crisis came in November. Adrian was working late, cross-referencing shipping records for the quarterly audit, when Robert burst into his office. His face was white. "We have a problem." Adrian looked up. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that destroys companies." Robert threw a document on the desk. "Read that." It was a letter from the Royal Maritime Commission. Official seal, formal language. The kind of bureaucratic prose that preceded catastrophe. Adrian's eyes scanned the text and his stomach dropped. Ashford Maritime was being investigated for smuggling contraband through their shipping routes. The commission had evidence, manifests, testimony, documents, suggesting the company had been transporting illegal goods for months. If the investigation concluded unfavorably, the company would lose its operating license, all assets would be seized, criminal charges would follow. "This is insane," Adrian said. "We don't smuggle anything." "I know that." Robert's voice was tight. "You know that. But someone's been falsifying our records, planting evidence, making it look like we're running contraband through legitimate shipments." "Who?" Robert pulled out more documents, shipping manifests that Adrian had never seen before, ledger entries in handwriting he didn't recognize, all dated over the past 6 months, all bearing Ashford Maritime's official stamps. "Someone inside the company," Robert said. "Someone with access to our documentation and shipping schedules." Adrian's mind raced through possibilities, then stopped cold. "Webb." Robert frowned. "What?" "Marcus Webb." Adrian stood abruptly. "He runs a shipping syndicate that competes with you. I had dealings with him." "What kind of dealings?" The kind Adrian had been trying to forget. The kind that had left him with a confession hanging over his head like a guillotine blade. He told Robert everything. About the spying, the betrayal, the choice he'd made to refuse. The confession Webb had released that destroyed what little reputation Adrian had left. Robert's face went hard as stone. "You brought this to my family's company." "No." Adrian's voice was firm. Webb's been planning this longer than I've been working here. This isn't about me. It's about destroying your sister. Evelyn? She controls shipping routes Webb wants. She's been blocking his expansion for years. Robert, this is revenge. He's using your company to get to her. Robert sat down heavily. If the commission rules against us, we're finished. Everything my family built, gone. Unless we prove it's fabricated. How? The evidence looks real. The manifests have our stamps. The ledger entries match our systems. Even if we claim forgery, who's going to believe us? Adrian looked at the documents spread across the desk, at the careful forgery, the meticulous planning. Webb hadn't just wanted to hurt Evelyn. He'd wanted to annihilate everything she'd built. And Adrian had given him the tools to do it, not intentionally. But his year of spying had provided Webb with inside knowledge of how Ashford Maritime operated. Enough knowledge to forge convincing documents. Enough to make the frame job stick. This was his fault. Not directly, but the chain of cause and effect led back to choices he'd made when he was desperate and broken. I know where Webb keeps his records, Adrian said quietly. Robert looked up sharply. What? When I worked for him, I met him at a townhouse in Mayfair. That's where he kept everything, contracts, ledgers, evidence. If he forged these documents, there'll be proof somewhere in that building. So we go to the authorities. They won't listen. We're already under investigation. Webb has connections everywhere. He's been planning this for months, maybe years. He'll have covered his tracks. Then what do you suggest? Adrian met Robert's eyes. We break in, find the evidence ourselves, bring it directly to the Maritime Commission before the investigation concludes. Robert stared at him. You're talking about burglary. I'm talking about survival. Adrian's voice was steady. Webb is trying to destroy your family the way he tried to use me to destroy Evelyn. If we don't fight back, you lose everything. And if we get caught, then we lose everything faster. Adrian leaned forward. But if we do nothing, you're finished anyway. At least this way you have a chance. Robert was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the sounds of the docks continued. Workers shouting, ships creaking. The endless rhythm of commerce that would stop completely if Ashford Maritime collapsed. When? Robert asked finally. Tonight. Adrian's pulse was racing, but his voice stayed calm. The longer we wait, the more time Webb has to destroy evidence. We go tonight, find what we need, and get out. We? You think I'm letting you do this alone? Robert stood. This is my family's company, my sister's future. If we're committing burglary, we're doing it together. They approached the Mayfair townhouse at midnight. The street was quiet, elegant, the kind of neighborhood where respectable people slept peacefully behind locked doors. Gas lamps cast pools of yellow light across cobblestones. A carriage passed in the distance, wheels clattering. Adrian and Robert stood in the shadows across from Webb's townhouse. How do we get in? Robert whispered. Adrian studied the building. 3 stories? Windows dark. But he remembered the layout from his meetings. The study was on the 2nd floor. The rear entrance led to a servant's corridor. Around back. There's a service door. It'll be locked, but the mechanism is old. We can force it. You've done this before? No, but I've had a lot of practice being desperate. They moved through the alley behind the townhouse. The service door was exactly where Adrian remembered. Heavy wood, iron lock. Robert pulled a crowbar from his coat. I brought this from the docks. The lock broke on the 3rd try. The sound was loud enough to make both men freeze, waiting for lights to appear in windows, for voices to shout alarm. Nothing happened. They slipped inside. The interior was dark and silent. Adrian led the way through the servants' corridor, up a narrow staircase, toward the study. His heart hammered against his ribs. His palms were sweating despite the cold. This was insane. If they got caught, they'd go to prison. Robert would lose everything. Adrian would lose what little he'd rebuilt. But Webb had left them no choice. Men who thought themselves untouchable made mistakes. They got arrogant, careless. Adrian was betting everything that Webb had kept evidence of his schemes because destroying evidence felt like admitting guilt. The study door was unlocked. Inside, moonlight filtered through tall windows. The room looked exactly as Adrian remembered. Desk, bookshelves, filing cabinets along one wall. Start with the cabinets, he whispered. Look for anything related to Ashford Maritime or shipping manifests. They worked in silence, pulling open drawers, rifling through documents. Most of it was legitimate business records, contracts, correspondence. Nothing incriminating. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Adrian's hands were shaking. They were running out of time. Someone could return home, a servant could check the rooms, a neighbor could notice the broken lock. "Robert," he hissed. "Anything?" "Nothing. Just standard." He stopped. Adrian turned. "What?" Robert was holding a leather portfolio. Inside were documents, shipping manifests with Ashford Maritime's letterhead, except these were the originals, the real ones, before they'd been altered. And beneath them, forged versions, side by side. Perfect evidence of the frame job. "That's it," Adrian breathed. "That's what we need. There's more." Robert pulled out a ledger. "Look at this." It was Webb's personal accounting book. Entries detailing payments to forgers, bribes to dock workers, money spent fabricating evidence, names, dates, amounts. Everything documented with the meticulous care of a man who never expected to be caught. "He kept records of everything," Robert said, voice filled with disbelief. "Arrogance." Adrian grabbed the portfolio. "Men like Webb think they're invincible. They document their crimes because it makes them feel powerful. Let's go. We have what we—" The door opened. Webb stood in the doorway, backlit by lamplight from the hallway. He wasn't alone. 2 large men flanked him. Hired muscle, probably. The kind who broke bones for money. Webb looked at Adrian and smiled. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Adrian's blood turned to ice. "You knew we were coming." "Of course I knew." Webb stepped into the room. "You're predictable, Adrian. Desperate men always are. I've had people watching Ashford Maritime for weeks. The moment Robert received that investigation notice, I knew you'd try something stupid." He gestured to the men behind him. They moved into the room, blocking the exit. "You can't possibly think you'll get away with this," Robert said, still clutching the portfolio. "We have evidence, proof of what you've done, evidence you stole by breaking into my home." Webb's smile widened. "Even if you manage to leave here, which you won't, that evidence is inadmissible. You obtained it through criminal means. The commission will laugh you out of the room." Adrian's mind raced. Webb was right. They'd played directly into his hands. The break-in gave him leverage. He could claim they'd planted evidence, fabricated documents, anything. They'd risked everything for nothing. Unless... Adrian looked at Webb, at the self-satisfied smirk, at the arrogance radiating from every pore. Men like Webb had one weakness. They loved hearing themselves talk, loved explaining how clever they were, loved the moment when their victims realized they'd been beaten. And if you kept them talking long enough, they made mistakes. "Why?" Adrian asked. "Why go to all this trouble just to destroy Eveline?" Webb's expression darkened. "Because she cost me millions. Because she refused every offer I made. Because she had the audacity to tell me no. So this is about wounded pride. This is about power." Webb's voice rose. "Your wife, your former wife, controls routes that should belong to me. She's blocked every expansion I've attempted. She's convinced investors to side with her instead of me. She's made me look weak in front of men who should fear me. And you couldn't stand it. Nobody refuses Marcus Webb. Nobody." Webb stepped closer. "I gave her chances, multiple chances. I offered partnerships, buyouts. She turned down every single one. So I decided to remove her from the equation entirely, by framing her company for smuggling, by destroying everything she's built. When the commission rules against Ashford Maritime, she'll lose her reputation, her investors, her credibility. She'll be ruined. Like you tried to ruin me." "You ruined yourself," Webb said dismissively. "I just helped the process along." Adrian felt something cold and hard crystallizing in his chest. Not anger, something sharper. Clarity. Webb had built his entire scheme on the assumption that Adrian was broken beyond repair, that he'd stay broken, that desperation would keep him compliant forever. But desperation, Adrian had learned, could cut both ways. When you had nothing left to lose, you became dangerous in ways powerful men never anticipated. "Robert," Adrian said quietly, "when I move, run." "What?" Webb laughed. "Run where? My men are blocking the door. There's no—" Adrian lunged. Not at Webb. At the window behind the desk. He hit the glass shoulder first. It shattered outward in an explosion of noise and cold air. For a moment he hung suspended in empty space, 3 stories above the street. Then gravity took over. He hit the ground hard. Something in his shoulder cracked. Pain exploded through his entire body. He rolled, gasping, tasting blood. Above him he heard shouting, running footsteps. Adrian forced himself upright. His vision swam. His shoulder screamed, but he was alive. And more importantly, he'd created a distraction. Robert appeared in the shattered window, portfolio clutched to his chest. He didn't hesitate, jumped, landed better than Adrian had. Rolled to his feet. "Run!" Adrian gasped. They ran. Behind them, Webb's men were pouring out of the townhouse, shouting, chasing. Adrian's lungs burned. His injured shoulder sent lightning bolts of agony through his body with every step. But he kept moving, Robert beside him, both of them sprinting through the dark Mayfair streets like criminals fleeing justice. Which, technically, they were. They cut through an alley, emerged onto a busier street, slowed to a fast walk, trying to blend into the late-night crowd. Adrian glanced back, no pursuit. They'd lost them. For now. "You're bleeding," Robert said, breathing hard. Adrian touched his face. His hand came away red. "I'll live." That was insane. It worked, barely. Robert clutched the portfolio tighter. "We have the evidence, but Webb was right. We stole it. The commission won't accept it. Then we don't give it to the commission." Adrian's mind was racing, running on adrenaline and pain and the sharp clarity that came from having jumped out of a third-story window. "We give it to someone who can use it without worrying about legal admissibility." "Who?" "Your sister." They reached Evelyn's townhouse an hour later. Adrian's shoulder had swollen to twice its normal size. His face was cut and bruised. He probably looked like he'd been in a street fight. Robert looked only marginally better. The butler who answered the door stared at them in horror. "We need to see Miss Ashford," Robert said. "It's urgent." The butler hesitated, then nodded, disappeared into the house. 2 minutes later, Evelyn appeared at the top of the stairs. She was in a dressing gown, hair loose around her shoulders. She looked like she'd been sleeping. Then she saw them and every trace of sleep vanished. What happened? She descended the stairs quickly, took in Adrian's injuries with clinical precision. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," Adrian said. His voice sounded rough even to his own ears. "We need to talk. Now." Evelyn looked at her brother. "Robert?" "Webb set us up," Robert said. "Framed the company for smuggling. We broke into his house to get proof. We found it." He held up the portfolio. Evelyn's expression went very still. "Come inside." They followed her to a sitting room. She lit lamps while Robert spread the documents across a table. Adrian sat down heavily, his body finally registering the full extent of the damage. His shoulder was probably dislocated. He definitely had cracked ribs. The cuts on his face stung, but they had the evidence. Evelyn examined the documents in silence. Her face showed nothing, but Adrian could see her mind working behind her eyes, processing implications and consequences at terrifying speed. Finally, she looked up. "This proves Webb forged the evidence against us." "Yes," Robert said. "But you obtained it illegally." "Yes." "Which means it's worthless in court. Unless," Adrian said quietly, "someone uses it differently." Evelyn turned to him. Her expression was unreadable. "What are you suggesting?" Adrian forced himself to focus through the pain. Webb's entire scheme depends on secrecy. On the commission believing your company is guilty and ruling against you before anyone discovers the truth. But what if the truth became public before the ruling? How? The newspapers. Adrian leaned forward despite the agony in his ribs. "Give this evidence to every major paper in London. Let them publish the story. Show how Webb fabricated everything. Turn this into a scandal so big the commission has to investigate him instead of you." "That could backfire," Robert said. "If the papers think we're just spreading lies to save ourselves." "They won't," Adrian interrupted, "because we're not just giving them documents. We're giving them Webb's own records, his accounting ledger showing payments to forgers, names of everyone he bribed. It's all there. The papers will eat it alive." Evelyn was watching him carefully. "And what happens to you when this story breaks? When people learn you're involved?" "I'll be implicated in the burglary." Adrian met her eyes. I'll probably face criminal charges. But that's irrelevant. What matters is stopping Webb before he destroys your company. Why? The question was soft, but it cut deeper than any blade. Why are you risking prison for my family's business? Adrian took a breath. His shoulder throbbed. His vision kept wanting to blur. But his mind was clear. Because this is my fault, he said. Not the forgery, not Webb's scheme, but I gave him the knowledge to pull it off. I spent a year spying on your brother's company and feeding information to a criminal. I created the vulnerability Webb exploited. You didn't know he'd do this. No, but I should have. Adrian's voice roughened. I should have known that dealing with men like Webb only ends one way. I should have refused from the beginning, and I didn't. So now I'm fixing it the only way I know how. By jumping out of windows and committing burglary? By doing whatever it takes, Adrian said, to protect the people I failed. Evelyn studied his face, looking for something. Honesty, maybe. Or proof that he'd actually changed. Adrian didn't know if she found it, but after a long moment, she nodded. I'll contact the Times tomorrow morning. Get them everything. They'll publish by afternoon. What about the commission? Robert asked. Once the story breaks, they'll have to investigate Webb. Evelyn's voice was calm, precise, the voice of someone solving a complex problem. The evidence against us will crumble under scrutiny, will be cleared within weeks. And Adrian? Evelyn looked at him. Her expression was complicated, layers of emotion Adrian couldn't parse. That depends on whether Webb presses charges for the burglary. He will, Adrian said. He'll want revenge. Then you'll face consequences. Evelyn's voice was gentle. You understand that? Yes. You could go to prison. I know, and you're willing to accept that. It wasn't a question. Adrian nodded anyway. If it protects your family, if it stops Webb. Yes. I'm willing. The room went quiet. Robert was staring at him like he'd grown a second head. Evelyn's expression remained unreadable. Finally, she spoke. Get some rest, both of you. Tomorrow's going to be difficult. She stood, walked to the door, paused. Adrian. He looked up. Thank you. 2 words. Simple. But they carried weight Adrian hadn't expected. He nodded. Evelyn left. Robert helped Adrian to a guest room. Neither spoke. There wasn't much to say. Adrian lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, while his body screamed and his mind raced. Tomorrow the story would break. Webb would be exposed. The fight would become public, and Adrian would face whatever came next. For the first time in his life, he'd chosen to stand in the fire instead of running from it. Whether he'd survive the flames remained to be seen. The Times ran the story on the front page. Maritime magnate exposed an elaborate fraud scheme. The headline screamed in bold type that took up a quarter of the page. Below it, smaller text, Webb syndicate accused of forging documents to destroy competitor. Adrian read it in Evelyn's sitting room while a doctor set his dislocated shoulder. The pain was extraordinary. He barely noticed. The article was thorough, devastating. It laid out Webb's entire conspiracy with the clinical precision of a surgeon opening a body to reveal disease. The forged manifests, the bribed dock workers, the payments to criminals. Everything documented in Webb's own ledger, now reproduced in careful detail for all of London to see. The doctor yanked Adrian's shoulder back into place. Adrian didn't make a sound, just kept reading while sweat poured down his face and his vision went white at the edges. By afternoon, every newspaper in London had picked up the story. By evening, the Maritime Commission had issued a statement suspending its investigation into Ashford Maritime, pending a full inquiry into Webb's activities. By midnight, constables had raided Webb's townhouse and placed him under arrest. Adrian learned this secondhand, lying in Evelyn's guest room with his arm in a sling and his ribs wrapped tight enough to make breathing difficult. Robert came to update him every few hours, looking progressively more relieved as the day unfolded. It's working, he said around 9 that evening. Webb's trying to claim the documents are forgeries, but nobody's buying it. Too many witnesses, too much corroborating evidence. He's finished. Adrian stared at the ceiling. Good. The commission sent word they're dropping all charges against us. Robert sat down in the chair beside the bed. We're clear. The company's safe. Because you risked everything. We both did. No. Adrian turned his head to look at Robert. I jumped out a window and ran away. You're the one who kept hold of the evidence. You're the one who got it to safety. Don't give me credit I didn't earn. Robert was quiet for a moment. Evelyn wants to see you tomorrow, when you're feeling better. What for? She didn't say. But Robert's expression was complicated. I think she wants to talk about what happens next. What happens next is, I face charges for burglary. Adrian's voice was flat. Webb will press charges even from prison, maybe especially from prison. Revenge is all he has left. Probably. Robert stood. But you knew that going in. Yes. Was it worth it? Adrian thought about that. About the year he'd spent drowning. About the choices that led him to Webb's doorstep. About jumping through a window because it was the only way to protect people who had every reason to let him burn. Ask me after the trial. Boss. The charges came 3 days later. Criminal trespass, burglary, destruction of property. The constables arrived at Evelyn's townhouse with a warrant and took Adrian into custody with professional courtesy that felt worse than brutality. He spent 2 weeks in a holding cell in Newgate Prison, waiting for trial. The cell was 8 feet square with a stone floor and a bucket in the corner. It smelled like rot and despair. Adrian had lived in worse places. The other prisoners left him alone once they learned he'd helped bring down Marcus Webb. Apparently Webb had made enemies even among criminals, the kind of enemies who appreciated seeing powerful men humbled. On the 14th day, Adrian's solicitor visited. The man's name was Henry Talbot, a young lawyer Evelyn had hired despite Adrian's protests. He had earnest eyes and the nervous energy of someone who believed the law still mattered. The trial's set for next Monday, Talbot said, sitting across from Adrian in the narrow visiting room. The prosecution has a strong case. You admitted to the break-in. There's physical evidence, witnesses who saw you fleeing the scene. I know, but we have character witnesses willing to testify. People who'll speak to your actions helping expose Webb's fraud. It might reduce the sentence. To what? Adrian's voice was tired. 5 years instead of 10? Talbot flinched. Possibly. Or we could argue mitigating circumstances. Claim you acted under duress. I wasn't under duress. I made a choice. That's not a legal defense. It's the truth. Adrian leaned back against the cold stone wall. I'm not going to lie to reduce my sentence. I broke into Webb's house. I stole his documents. I'm guilty. Tell the jury that. Talbot stared at him like he'd lost his mind. That's suicide. Maybe. But I'm done lying. Done making excuses. I did what I did. Now I'll face what comes, even if what comes is a decade in prison? Adrian met his eyes. Even then, he ticked. The trial lasted 3 days. The courtroom was packed. Apparently the fall of Marcus Webb had captured London's imagination, and watching one of his victims face justice provided entertainment for the masses. Adrian sat in the defendant's box and listened to the prosecution lay out his crimes with methodical precision. They were right about everything. He had broken in, he had stolen, he had caused significant property damage when he jumped through that window. The evidence was overwhelming. On the second day, Talbot called his character witnesses. Robert Ashford testified first, spoke about Adrian's work at the company, his transformation over the past year, his willingness to risk everything to protect others. The prosecutor tore him apart on cross-examination, pointed out that family loyalty might color Robert's testimony, suggested Adrian had manipulated the Ashfords to avoid consequences. Next came Adrian's former co-workers from the docks, men who'd worked alongside him loading crates and managing shipments. They testified he'd been reliable, hardworking, honest. The prosecutor dismissed them as irrelevant. Character doesn't erase crime, he said smoothly. Then Evelyn took the stand. The courtroom went silent. She wore dark blue, severe and elegant. Her hair was pinned up. Her face showed no emotion as she swore her oath and sat in the witness box. Talbot approached carefully. Miss Ashford, how would you characterize your relationship with the defendant? Evelyn's eyes found Adrian across the courtroom. He couldn't read her expression. Complicated, she said. In what way? We were married for 6 years. He treated me poorly, humiliated me publicly, wasted the fortune I built. When I finally left him, he was already destroying himself. I had no reason to help him, no reason to forgive him. The courtroom hung on every word.
And yet, Talbot prompted gently, he risked his freedom to protect your family's company. Yes. Why do you think he did that? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Because he's trying to become someone better than the man I divorced. Because he understands that power without responsibility destroys everything it touches. Because somewhere in the wreckage of his old life, he found something worth protecting. She paused, even if that something wasn't himself.
The prosecutor stood for cross-examination. His voice was sharp, accusatory. Miss Ashford, isn't it true that you hired the defendant despite his history of betrayal and incompetence? I gave him an opportunity to prove himself. There's a difference. An opportunity he used to commit crimes that benefited your company. An opportunity he used to expose a criminal conspiracy. Evelyn's voice never rose, but it cut like a blade. Marcus Webb tried to destroy my business through fraud and forgery. The defendant helped stop him. If that's a crime, then perhaps we should examine what justice actually means. The prosecutor tried several more angles. Evelyn deflected each one with surgical precision. When she stepped down, the jury looked thoughtful. Adrian felt something crack in his chest. Not pain. Something softer. Something that felt dangerously like hope. On the third day, Adrian testified. Talbot had advised against it. Defendants rarely helped their own cases, but Adrian insisted. He took the stand and told the truth. All of it. He described his fall, the year of poverty, Webb's recruitment, the spine, the confession, the choice to refuse betraying Evelyn even when it meant his own destruction. Then he described the break-in, the decision to act, the jump through the window, the consequences he'd known were coming. The prosecutor asked him one question during cross-examination. Do you regret breaking into Mr. Webb's home? Adrian thought about that. About the cold calculation behind the question. About the answer the law wanted versus the answer that was true. I regret that it was necessary, he said finally. But I don't regret doing it. Webb was destroying innocent people. Someone had to stop him. If the price for that is prison, then I'll pay it. The courtroom murmured. The prosecutor smiled thinly. No further questions. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their faces were unreadable. The judge asked for the verdict. The foreman stood. On the charge of criminal trespass, we find the defendant guilty. Adrian's hands tightened on the railing. On the charge of burglary, we find the defendant guilty. His breath stayed steady. He'd expected this. On the charge of destruction of property, we find the defendant guilty. The judge nodded, looked at Adrian. Mr. Blackthorne, you've been found guilty on all charges. Before I pass sentence, do you have anything to say? Adrian stood. His shoulders still ached. His ribs were healing slowly, but his voice was clear. Yes, Your Honor, I'm guilty of everything I'm accused of. I broke the law knowingly and willingly. I don't ask for leniency or mercy. I ask only that the court recognize why I acted. Marcus Webb was destroying innocent people through fraud. The legal system was too slow to stop him, so I acted outside the law to protect people who deserved protection. He paused. I'm not a hero. I'm a man who spent most of his life being worthless and cruel and self-absorbed. I'm trying to be better. If that requires prison, then I'll serve my sentence and keep trying when I get out. The courtroom was silent. The judge studied him for a long moment. Mr. Blackthorne, the law exists to prevent exactly the kind of vigilante action you engaged in. No matter how noble your intentions, you committed serious crimes. You violated private property. You stole documents. You caused significant damage. However, the word hung in the air. The court also recognizes that your actions directly led to the exposure of a criminal conspiracy that would have destroyed a legitimate business and harmed dozens of innocent workers. Your testimony against Mr. Webb was crucial to his prosecution, and multiple witnesses have testified to your genuine attempts at rehabilitation. Therefore, I sentence you to 2 years imprisonment, suspended pending completion of 5 years probation, and full restitution for damages caused. Adrian's mind went blank. Suspended? You'll serve no jail time, the judge continued, provided you comply with all probation requirements and cause no further legal trouble. Consider this your opportunity to prove the change you claim is real. The gavel fell. Adrian stood there, unable to process what had just happened. Talbot grabbed his arm. We won, he said, voice shaking with excitement. "You're free." Free. The word felt foreign. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, reporters shouting questions, spectators craning for a glimpse, the chaos of public spectacle. Adrian pushed through them, head down, saying nothing. He made it 3 blocks before Eveline's carriage pulled up beside him. The door opened. She looked out. "Get in." He hesitated, then climbed inside. The carriage started moving. Evelyn sat across from him, expression unreadable in the dim interior. "You testified for me," Adrian said. "I testified truthfully." "You could have said nothing. Let me take the full sentence." "Yes." Evelyn's voice was quiet. "I could have." "Why didn't you?" "Because you jumped through a window to protect my family." Her eyes met his. "Because you chose prison over betraying me. Because somewhere in the past year, you became someone I didn't recognize anymore. In a good way or bad way?" "I don't know yet." She looked out the window at London passing by. "You're not the man I married. That man was selfish and cruel and completely oblivious to anyone's suffering but his own. But you're not entirely different either. You're still arrogant, still reckless, still convinced you can fix things through dramatic gestures." Adrian almost smiled. "That's fair. The difference is now you're willing to pay for those gestures." Evelyn turned back to him. The old Adrian would have found some way to escape consequences. Blamed someone else. Manipulated the system. You stood in court and admitted guilt without flinching. That's new. The carriage rolled through streets Adrian used to know when he was someone else, when he had a title and money and the comfortable certainty that the world existed to serve him. That world was gone. Burned to ash by his own stupidity and rebuilt slowly through choices that hurt. "Where are we going?" he asked. "My townhouse. You need somewhere to stay while you figure out your next steps." "I can't accept that." "Why not?" "Because I don't deserve your help." Adrian's voice roughened. "I destroyed you, Evelyn. I humiliated you publicly. I wasted years of your life married to a man who treated you like furniture. You should hate me." "I did hate you. For months." She folded her hands in her lap. "I hated you so much I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. All I wanted was to watch you suffer the way you made me suffer. And now I'm tired of hating." Evelyn's eyes were steady. "Hate takes energy I'd rather spend building something worthwhile. You're trying to change. That doesn't erase what you did. But it's more than most people manage. So I'm offering you a place to stay while you find your feet. Not because I forgive you, not because we're friends, but because I choose to help someone who's trying." Adrian felt something hot behind his eyes. He blinked it away. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet." She almost smiled. "You're still on probation. One mistake and you go to prison for 2 years. Try not to jump through any more windows." Continues. The months that followed were strange. Adrian lived in a small room on the top floor of Evelyn's townhouse. He continued working at Ashford Maritime, promoted to senior manager after Robert recognized his contributions. The pay was decent, the work was honest. He saw Evelyn most days, but they maintained careful distance. Polite conversations over breakfast. Brief discussions of business. The cautious interaction of 2 people rebuilding trust from absolute zero. Slowly, imperceptibly, something shifted. It started small. Evelyn asking his opinion on a shipping contract. Adrian offering suggestions that she actually considered. Conversations extending past bare necessity into something approaching genuine discussion. One evening in late spring, they sat in her study going over quarterly reports. Rain drummed against the windows. The fire in the hearth made the room warm. Evelyn set down her pen, rubbed her eyes. "Long day?" Adrian asked. "Long year." She smiled tiredly. "But profitable. We're expanding into 3 new routes next quarter. That's good." "It is." She looked at him. "Your analysis of the Mediterranean markets was particularly helpful. Just doing my job. You're good at it. Better than I expected." Evelyn's voice softened slightly. "You've built something real, Adrian. A career based on competence instead of inheritance. That takes courage. Or desperation. Maybe both." She stood, moved to the window, looked out at rain-soaked London. "When I divorced you, I thought you'd disappear. Drink yourself to death or flee to the continent or
find some other way to avoid facing what you'd become. I didn't think you'd actually change. Did you want me to change? Honestly? No. Evelyn's reflection showed in the dark glass. I wanted you to suffer, to understand what you'd taken from me, to spend the rest of your life regretting what you destroyed. And now?
Now I think suffering taught you something I could never have explained. Her voice was quiet. You had to lose everything to understand what anything was worth, including yourself. Adrian stood, moved to stand beside her at the window. Their reflections overlapped in the glass. I'm sorry, he said, for all of it. I know I've said it before, but I need you to know I mean it. You deserved better than what I gave you, better than who I was. Evelyn was silent for a long moment. I know you mean it. She turned to face him. I can see it in how you work, how you treat people, how you've rebuilt your entire life from nothing. Apologies are just words, Adrian, but actions are proof, and your actions are finally matching what you say. Is that forgiveness? It's acknowledgement. Evelyn's eyes searched his face. Forgiveness is complicated. Maybe someday. But right now I can acknowledge that you're trying, that you've changed, that the man standing here isn't the man I divorced. That's more than I deserve. Probably. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. But I'm giving it to you anyway. Summer arrived with unusual heat. London baked under cloudless skies. The Thames ran low. People moved slowly through streets that shimmered with heat haze. Adrian spent his days managing shipments and his evenings reading in the townhouse garden. Simple routine. Predictable. Safe. He'd learned to value safety. One afternoon, Robert found him reviewing manifests in the dockside office. Adrian, got a minute? Always. Adrian set down his pen. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Robert sat. Actually, everything's going right. We're expanding faster than projected. Profits are up 30%. The company's thriving. That's good news. It is. Robert leaned forward, which is why the board wants to make you a partner. Adrian went very still. What? Junior partner. 5% stake in the company. Full voting rights. Official position on the management board. The words felt unreal. Robert, I can't accept that. Why not? Because 6 months ago I was committing crimes. Because I don't deserve— Stop! Robert's voice was sharp. You've earned this. Through work, through competence, through putting the company's interests above your own. The board voted unanimously. Even the members who hate you personally admitted you've proven your value. Adrian's throat felt tight. I don't know what to say. Say yes. Robert smiled slightly. Or I'll be insulted that you're turning down my company. Adrian looked at his hands, calloused now from a year of real work, changed in ways he couldn't have imagined when he was Duke Adrian Blackthorne, master of nothing. Yes, he said quietly. Thank you. The partnership was formalized in August. Adrian signed the papers in Evelyn's study with Robert and 3 board members as witnesses. His hand shook slightly as he wrote his name, not from fear, from the weight of something genuine finally being his. After the board members left, Robert poured whiskey for the 3 of them. To new beginnings, he said, raising his glass. They drank. Evelyn set down her glass and looked at Adrian. This is what you should have had all along. Success earned through effort instead of inherited. Respect built on competence instead of title. Feels different, Adrian admitted. Better or worse? Just different. He turned the glass in his hands. When I was a duke, everything came easy. Power, money, access. I never had to work for anything, never had to prove I deserved what I had. And now? Now I work 12 hours a day to earn 5% of something I used to think was beneath me. Adrian smiled without humor. And it feels more valuable than anything I ever inherited. Robert refilled their glasses. That's growth. Or perspective. Evelyn's voice was thoughtful. Sometimes they're the same thing. Autumn came with the smell of burning leaves and shorter days. Adrian and Evelyn fell into an easy rhythm. Morning meetings about business. Evening conversations that drifted beyond work into territory they'd never explored during their marriage. He learned she loved astronomy. that she'd taught herself celestial navigation to understand shipping routes better, that she'd wanted to travel but never had time because she was too busy saving his estate from collapse. She learned he'd never actually read most of the books in Blackthorn Manor's library, that his father had terrified him as a child, that he'd spent his entire youth performing for an audience that applauded his worst impulses. One evening in October, they sat in the garden under a sky brilliant with stars. "When we were married," Evelyn said quietly, "did you ever love me?" Adrian had known this question would come eventually. He'd prepared answers, excuses, ways to soften the truth. But he'd promised himself no more lies. "No," he said, "I didn't." Evelyn didn't flinch, just nodded. "I knew. But I think part of me hoped I was wrong. I'm sorry." "Don't be." She looked up at the stars. "You can't love someone you don't see, and you never really saw me. I was just part of the scenery, useful furniture that kept your life functioning. That's an incredibly generous way to describe how I treated you. I'm feeling generous tonight." Evelyn smiled slightly. "Besides, anger gets exhausting. Eventually you either let it go or let it consume you. Which did you choose?" "I'm still deciding." She turned to look at him. "Do you see me now?" The question hung between them like smoke. Adrian thought about it, really thought about it. "Yes," he said finally. "I see someone brilliant and ruthless and stronger than anyone I've ever known. Someone who saved a drowning man repeatedly and got nothing but contempt in return. Someone who built an empire while I played pretend king." He paused. "I see someone I respect more than I've ever respected anyone, including myself." Evelyn held his gaze. "That's a start." Chimban. Winter returned. Not the brutal winter of Adrian's fall, but something softer. Snow that made London beautiful instead of cruel. On the anniversary of the Royal Winter Assembly, where everything had collapsed, Adrian stood in his office looking out at the docks. 1 year since Evelyn had destroyed him publicly. 1 year since he'd lost everything. He was 32 years old. He owned 5% of a thriving company. He had work that mattered and colleagues who respected him. He had a room in a townhouse that wasn't his, but felt more like home than any estate ever had. He had a future built on what he'd earned instead of what he'd inherited. It wasn't the life he'd imagined at 21. It was better. The door opened. Evelyn entered carrying 2 glasses of wine. Robert said, "You've been up here for hours, just thinking." Adrian took the offered glass. 1 year ago tonight, I stood in a ballroom and watched my entire world end. Evelyn moved to stand beside him at the window. And now? Now I'm watching ships come in carrying cargo I helped coordinate, working for a company I partly own, standing next to the woman I destroyed, who somehow decided I was worth a second chance. Life is strange, unbearably so. He sipped the wine. "Do you regret it, giving me that chance?" Evelyn considered. "Ask me again in a year. Fair enough." They stood in comfortable silence, watching snow fall over the Thames. Finally, Evelyn spoke. "I'm planning a spring gala. Major investors, politicians, the usual crowd. I'd like you to attend." Adrian's chest tightened. "As a partner in the company or as your former husband?" "As someone I trust." She met his eyes. "And maybe as someone I'm learning to like again, in a completely different way than before." The words settled between them. Fragile. Weighted with history and possibility. "I'd be honored," Adrian said quietly. "Don't make me regret this. I'll try not to." Evelyn smiled. A real smile, unguarded in a way Adrian had never seen during their marriage. "That's all I ask." The gala took place in May. Evelyn's townhouse was transformed into something magical. Flowers everywhere, music drifting through open windows, 300 guests moving through rooms that sparkled with candlelight. Adrian stood near the entrance watching people arrive, lords and ladies and business magnates who would have cut him in the street 2 years ago. Now they nodded politely, acknowledged his presence, treated him like he belonged, because he did belong, not through birthright, but through merit. Lord Haverford approached, extending his hand. "Mr. Blackthorn, good to see you." Adrian shook it. "Lord Haverford, I hear the Mediterranean expansion is proceeding ahead of schedule. Impressive work." "Thank you." Haverford lowered his voice. "I'll admit, When I heard Evelyn had hired you, I thought she was mad. But you've proven yourself. That takes character. He moved on before Adrian could respond. Character. Adrian had spent 30 years believing character was something you inherited along with titles and property. That some people were simply better than others by accident of birth. He'd been catastrophically wrong. Character was what remained when everything else burned away. It was the choices you made when no one was watching and nothing was at stake except your own conscience. It was jumping through windows to protect people who didn't owe you anything. It was standing in court and admitting guilt without excuses. It was working 12-hour days to earn something real instead of coasting on something borrowed. Evelyn found him an hour into the gala. She looked stunning in deep emerald silk, hair swept up, diamonds at her throat. Every head turned when she entered a room, not because she demanded attention, but because she commanded it effortlessly. Having fun? She asked. Define fun. She laughed. Come with me. There's someone I want you to meet. She led him through the crowd to a small group near the windows. Investors he vaguely recognized from board meetings. Gentlemen, this is Adrian Blackthorne, our newest junior partner. They shook hands, talked business, discussed quarterly projections and shipping routes and market opportunities. Normal conversation, professional, boring in the best possible way. Later, as the crowd thinned and music played softly, Evelyn pulled Adrian onto the terrace. The night was warm, stars visible between London's usual clouds. The city spread out below them like a carpet of lights. Thank you, Adrian said. For what? For this. All of it, the job, the partnership, the chance to prove I could be something other than a disaster. Evelyn leaned against the balustrade. You proved that yourself. I just didn't get in your way. You did more than that. Maybe. She looked at him. But ultimately, you're the one who had to change. No one could do it for you. Do you think I have? Changed, I mean. Evelyn considered. The old Adrian wouldn't have asked that question. He would have assumed he was perfect and everyone else was wrong. So yes, you've changed. She paused. The question is whether you'll stay changed when things get comfortable again. When success stops requiring constant effort, that's when most people revert. I won't. How can you be sure? Because I remember what it cost to fail. Adrian's voice was quiet, but certain. I remember sleeping in doorways and working at the docks and thinking I'd die alone and forgotten. I remember what rock bottom feels like, and I never want to go back. Good. Evelyn's hand brushed his on the railing. Brief, almost accidental. Then hold on to that memory. Let it remind you why the work matters. Summer arrived. The company thrived. Adrian's reputation grew. People who'd written him off as a cautionary tale started acknowledging him as a legitimate businessman. He and Evelyn developed something that resembled friendship, not the careful politeness of former spouses navigating shared space. Actual friendship. They worked together, laughed together, argued about shipping routes and investment strategies. Occasionally, late at night when they were both too tired to maintain pretense, they talked about the marriage. What would you have done differently? Evelyn asked one evening. If you could go back? Adrian thought about it. Everything. I would have listened when you spoke, asked about your work, treated you like a partner instead of an accessory. I would have seen you for who you were instead of who I needed you to be. Evelyn was quiet. Would you have loved me? The question cut deeper than any blade. Adrian looked at her across the sitting room, really looked at her, at the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her posture, the quiet competence that radiated from every gesture. Yes, he said. If I'd been capable of seeing you, I would have loved you. How could I not? But you weren't capable then. No. I was too broken, too arrogant, too convinced the world existed to serve me. Adrian's voice roughened. I had to lose everything to understand what anything was worth, including you. Evelyn smiled sadly. That's the tragedy, isn't it? By the time you learned to see me, I'd already left. Yes. Can't go back. No. Adrian met her eyes. But maybe we can build something new. Not what we had. Something better. Something honest. Like what? I don't know yet. He smiled. But I'm willing to find out if you are. Evelyn studied his face for a long moment. Then she stood, crossed the room, sat beside him on the sofa, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Me too," she said quietly. Sot. Autumn came again. 2 years since Adrian had stood in a ballroom and watched his world collapse. 2 years since Evelyn had walked away from their marriage. They were different people now, both of them. Adrian had learned what it meant to work for something, to fail, to rebuild from nothing, to value competence over birthright and substance over appearance. Evelyn had learned that revenge was empty and forgiveness was hard, but moving forward was necessary. On a cool October evening, they stood on the docks watching ships prepare for departure. Cargo bound for India, China, ports Adrian had only read about in books he'd never actually understood. "We've come a long way," Evelyn said. "We?" "All of us. The company, you, me. 2 years ago we were at war. Now we're partners, business partners." Evelyn glanced at him. "Is that all?" Adrian's heart skipped. "I don't know. What else would we be? I'm asking you." The question hung in the salt air between them. Adrian thought about his answer carefully, about truth versus what he wanted, about whether he'd earned the right to want anything from her. "I'd like to be more," he said finally, "but I don't know if that's possible, or fair to you. I destroyed what we had before. I have no right to ask for another chance at something deeper." "You don't." Evelyn's voice was soft. "But I might give it to you anyway." Adrian's breath caught. "Why?" "Because I've watched you build yourself into someone worth knowing. Because you've proven change is possible. Because I'm tired of letting the past control the future." She turned to face him fully. "Because when I look at you now, I don't see the man who humiliated me. I see someone who risked everything to protect my family. Someone who works harder than anyone I know. Someone who's finally learned what love actually requires. Which is seeing the other person. Really seeing them. Not as furniture or accessory or means to an end, but as someone complete and complicated and worthy of respect." Adrian felt something tight in his chest loosen. "I see you now. I swear I do." "I know." Evelyn smiled. "That's why I'm willing to try." They took it slowly. Dinners that gradually became dates. Conversations that deepened into real intimacy. The careful rebuilding of trust between two people who'd destroyed each other and somehow found their way back. It wasn't easy. Old wounds surfaced, arguments erupted. More than once they nearly gave up. But they didn't. Because both of them had learned that anything worth having required work. That love wasn't a feeling but a choice made daily. That respect and honesty mattered more than passion. 6 months later, on a spring morning that smelled like rain and new beginnings, Adrian woke in Evelyn's bedroom to find her watching him. "What?" he asked, voice rough with sleep. "Just thinking?" She traced a finger along his jaw. "About how different this is from before. Better or worse?" "Immeasurably better." She smiled. "The first time around, we were playing roles, Lord and Lady, Duke and Duchess. Neither of us was real, and now we're just two people who've been through hell and decided we're better together than apart." Adrian pulled her closer. "I love you. You know that, right?" "I know." Evelyn kissed him softly. "I love you too. This version of you. The one who had to die to learn how to live. Protect." 5 years after the assembly, Adrian stood in a ballroom again. Not the same one. This was Evelyn's gala, held in a grand hotel overlooking the Thames. 500 guests, music and champagne and the glitter of wealth. But this time, Adrian belonged. He moved through the crowd with Evelyn at his side, not as her accessory, as her equal partner in business and life. People who'd cut him in the street now sought his advice. Investors who'd mocked him now asked for his analysis. He'd built something real from absolute nothing. Lord Haverford approached with champagne. "A toast," he announced, "to Adrian and Evelyn, the most unlikely success story in London." The crowd raised their glasses. Adrian looked at Evelyn. She looked back. In her eyes, he saw everything they'd survived, everything they'd built, everything they'd become. He raised his glass. "To second chances," he said, "and the work required to deserve them." They drank. The music started. Evelyn pulled him onto the dance floor. As they moved through the steps, Adrian thought about the man he'd been, the hollow duke who'd had everything and valued nothing, who'd destroyed a brilliant woman because he was too arrogant to see her worth. That man was dead. In his place stood someone harder, scarred, but real in ways the old Adrian had never been. Power hadn't made him strong. Losing it had. Humiliation hadn't destroyed him. It had revealed what was worth building. And love, real love, the kind that required work and honesty and seeing another person completely, that was the only thing worth having after everything else burned away. Evelyn leaned closer as they danced. Happy? Yes, Adrian said. For the first time in my life. Actually, yes. Good. She smiled. Because you've earned it. We've earned it. She rested her head against his shoulder. Through the windows, London sprawled beneath them. A city of millions, each person fighting their own battles. Falling, rising, learning or refusing to learn. Adrian had fallen harder than most, but he'd also risen. And in the rising, in the brutal work of rebuilding from ashes, he'd found something his title and wealth had never given him. Himself. The music swelled. The crowd danced. And Adrian Blackthorne, no longer a duke, no longer hollow, finally whole, held the woman he'd destroyed and rebuilt himself to deserve. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.